everyone, Miss W here with a short review over biomolecules. First, let's look at the word itself, biomolecules. We know that the word bio means living. So literally, if we put this together, this is living molecules. But let's not get confused here. Molecules, we know, are not alive. In fact, life does not begin on that hierarchy of life until we get to cells. So these aren't molecules that are alive, they're just molecules necessary for life. And if you think about it, biomolecules are all the molecules that make up you. It's basically what you're made out of. So these are pretty important. Let's take a closer look. First, I want to direct your attention to this chart. This chart can be found on my website, and I've said it a couple times. It's something that you need to go to and get familiar with. Even though your Connexus lessons don't go into much detail on biomolecules, it is a very important STAR topic. And this chart pretty much sums up everything that you guys need to know. First, we know that there are 4 of our biomolecules. We have carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. You guys need to know the function of each. When I talk about energy for the body, you should immediately think of carbohydrates. What are the food sources for carbohydrates? Well, anything that's plant-based. So this would include all of your grains, all of your veggies, all of your fruit, and sugar. This one is something we forget about a lot. When you think of sugar, you think of, oh, that's something bad for me. But sugar still comes from a plant, comes from cane sugar. So that's going to be a carbohydrate. And a simple sugar is what we call glucose. This is a simple sugar. In fact, this molecule is extremely important to our body. This is going to be what your body breaks down during cellular respiration to make ATP, which is energy that our cells can use. So this is huge. This is how our cells run. All right, so keep that in mind. Speaking of glucose, this is a glucose molecule. It is also called a monosaccharide. Let's break this word down. Mono means one, and saccharide actually means sugar. So we're looking at one sugar molecule. In other words, one glucose. And there's other types of saccharides that we can have, like fructose and some other things. But the most famous one that you guys need to be aware of is definitely glucose. Which takes us to our polysaccharide. Again, let's break that word in half. We know that poly means many, and we know that saccharide means sugar. So here we're going to have many sugars. And really, it's just a long chain of our monosaccharides put together. We have 1, 2, 3 here. Another thing that we need to know about our carbohydrates is that they're polar. And if you remember back to my water lesson, anything that's polar will dissolve in water. So think of Kool-Aid, for example. Kool-Aid is made of mostly sugar. Does Kool-Aid powder dissolve in water? Yes, it does. That's how we get that delicious drink. So there's an example of that. Well, let's move on to proteins. Proteins are going to be mainly for structural functions, but they're also going to promote chemical reactions. And this is a pretty important topic that we're going to cover in our next video, and that's enzymes. A good source of protein is anything that has protein in it. So you guys think mainly of meats, dairy and eggs, fish. Some nuts have a good source of protein. Some examples of this are collagen, keratin, and myosin. When we look closer at a protein monomer, we have what's called an amino acid. And the reason that it is called an amino is because of this group right here. This is called the amino group, and I know that because of nitrogen. That's how those kind of words connect. Anything that has that nitrogen in it normally has something to do with an amino. We also have a carboxyl group and an R group. And that R group is going to be different for each amino acid. And there's actually 20 amino acids that you guys are going to learn about this year. I'll save that for another lesson though. Now, again, when we take this amino acid and we start linking them together, we're going to get what's called a polypeptide. So again, let's break this word in half. Poly means many, and in this time, peptide is going to refer to proteins. So here we have many proteins together. And again, this is a polar molecule. So that means it'll dissolve in water. Now let's move on to lipids. Lipids are for long-term storage in the body. And this is really easy for you to remember. Where does your body store long-term energy? Well, it's stored in your fat cells. So that helps me remember lipids are fats. These are also going to be very important for the cell membrane. And again, we're going to see that later in a different lesson. Some examples or sources for your lipids are going to be, well, let's start with examples. Cholesterol, phospholipids, which is going to be what we see in our membranes, fatty acids, and pigments, steroids and waxes. And sources, of course, will be anything that's high in fat, like oil, butter, cheesecake. So lipids are kind of weird in that they don't really form long chains like our polysaccharide and our polypeptide. Instead, we have fatty acids, which are going to be considered our monomers. And there's two types. There's saturated and there's unsaturated. The saturated is just going to be a long chain of carbons with hydrogens coming off of each one. The unsaturated is going to be missing some of those hydrogens. So like right here, for example, it only has one hydrogen on that C, and instead it forms a double bond with the next carbon. So what this does is it creates a kink or a bend in that fatty acid. And that's going to play an important role later on when we talk about the cell membrane. Well, what is our polymer then? Most of the time, we're going to see a polymer in the form of a triglyceride, which is a glycerol with 3 fatty acid chains coming off of it. So here's the first one, second one, and third one. And again, it's called a triglyceride, so if we break it in half, we have tri, meaning 3, and glyceride is going to refer to these particular fatty acid chains. And what's another thing that's very important about these lipids is that they're nonpolar. They're our only biomolecule that does not dissolve in water, and that's something important to note. Okay, let's look at last one, nucleic acids, but this one's probably one of the most important because it stores our genetic material. And in case you're wondering, your genetic material is what makes you you. And so you can imagine this is probably our most important biomolecule, and it's interesting that this is the only one not found in food. Instead, your body is going to produce it, and it's going to produce it based on previous cells. So that very first cell that fused from a sperm and an egg to become you carries that DNA that's going to play the template to create the DNA for all the other cells in your body. And don't worry about that because we're going to come back to that in another lesson as well. But let's look at the examples. We have DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, RNA, which is ribonucleic acid, and ATP, which is a really special nucleic acid. It only comes in the monomer form, and it actually stands for adenotriphosphate. So instead of just one phosphate, it's going to have 3, and this is actually the energy that your cells use. So we'll definitely be coming back to this guy when we talk about cellular respiration. Well, what does a typical nucleotide look like? This is it right here. And we have 3 important parts on here. We have a phosphate group. We have what we call a base. And we have a sugar. And it is important to note how these are connected. And I have a little song for that. The phosphate's connected to the sugar. The base is connected to the sugar. So it's important to note that the sugar's in the middle, and on one side is connected the phosphate group, and on the other side you'll find the base. And there are actually 5 different bases that we can find in our body. And we'll learn more about those 5 bases when we talk about DNA later on this semester. And I know this picture is hard to see, but basically when we connect these together, we're going to have what's called a sugar phosphate backbone. All of your sugars and phosphates are going to line up, one sugar from one molecule will connect to the phosphate of the next one, so on and so forth. And then sticking off, you're going to have your bases. And this is very important because when we form a DNA, you're going to have another backbone over here, and then those bases are going to be able to connect via hydrogen bond. Again, we can talk more about that when we get to our DNA unit. But it is important to note that these are also polar, for the most part, and can dissolve in water. All right, so it is important to be able to identify structures. And this was a part of your C notes that you guys had in our live lesson today. And so I just wanted to show these again so that you had a chance to identify each one. Again, we have our amino acid, which is our protein. It's going to have that amino group, the R group, which is going to be different for each one of our 20 amino acids, and the carboxyl group or the carboxylic acid group. We have a monosaccharide, which is a carbohydrate. This is probably one of those ones that you should definitely be able to recognize by heart. This shape, anytime you see that shape, you need to immediately think glucose or monosaccharide. And then finally we have our fatty acid, which is a lipid. If you look closely at this one, you will notice that I have a bend right here. So what kind of fatty acid is this? A saturated, meaning that it's full of hydrogen, or an unsaturated, meaning it's missing a couple? Yes, this one would be unsaturated because of the double bond. And I know you can't see it because of the picture, but you get the idea because it's bent. So naming our polymers, we have our triglyceride, which is our lipid. Again, I have my my glyceride group with 3 fatty acids attached. Here's my one that is unsaturated. We have our DNA, which is a polynucleotide, meaning many nucleotides. It's a nucleic acid. We have our polypeptide, which most of the time you guys are going to see these represented just as a long strand of beads. But look for the word amino acids. That'll help you remember that this is an amino acid chain, also called a polypeptide, which is our protein. And then finally we have our polysaccharides, which are carbohydrates. So again, that structure that I need to know by heart, just all linked together. One last thing that you guys do need to know about biomolecules is how they form into polymers or how they break into monomers. So let's look at that on the molecular level. If you guys will put your attention down here, we have a new word called dehydration synthesis. And all this really means is that I'm going to remove a water molecule. So if you'll look here, on the end of this molecule, I have a hydrogen. And on the end of this molecule here, I have a hydroxide. So if I take those and I put them together, I'm going to get H2O. So if I take that water molecule out, I now have a chain. And this is going to be how we form those polymers. Well, what do I do when I want to break them? You might start to think, oh wow, this water molecule is pretty important because it does come in and breaks them. So the water molecule is going to come in and it'll break apart, and one hydrogen will attach to this molecule and the OH group will attach to the other side. And because of that, we now have broken apart that polymer, and that's how we get our monomers. So this is very important for food digestion so that we can break them apart and then put them back together in a new structure that our bodies can use. And really, that's all you need to know about biomolecules. Study the chart, know all the structures and the functions and the sources, know their polarity, and if you have any questions, please just reach out to me for help.